I want to tell you about a stainless steel screw that finally taught me something no book ever did. 12 years ago, I built a garden bench for my wife, Ingrid. Good white oak, quarter sawn, the kind of board you set aside and feel a little proud of before you have even cut it. I drove long stainless screws through the seat rails because that is what a careful man does. Stainless does not rust. Everyone knows that. And for 3 summers, that bench sat under the birch by the kitchen window and held just fine. Then, one October morning, I sat down on it and felt the rail give. Not break, give. A soft, sickening little travel, the kind you feel in your spine before you understand it. I turned that bench over on the grass and backed the screws out, and around every single one, the oak had gone dark and soft and punky, a gray stain bleeding into the grain like a bruise. The wood right where I needed it strongest had rotted from the inside out. The screws were perfect. The wood had died around them. That is the day I went looking for the old way, and the old way had a name, and the name was a wooden peg. So here is the question I could not answer that morning, and the one I'm going to answer for you today. How does a dry stick of oak, driven through 2 boards with nothing but a mallet, outlast a steel fastener that was engineered in a laboratory to never fail? Let me show you. The men who built wooden warships never trusted iron the way we do. They had watched it fail for 1,000 years. When you drive an iron bolt or an iron nail into oak, especially oak that is going to live outdoors or at sea, you start a slow, quiet war inside the wood. Oak is full of tannin, that same bitter acid that tans leather and turns a cut board that faint honey brown. Tannin and iron despise each other. The moisture in the wood carries the acid to the metal begins to corrode, and the corrosion feeds back into the fibers and eats them. Shipwrights had a word for it. They called it iron sickness. The wood around the fastener would go black and crumbling and weak, exactly the gray bruise I found under my bench, and once a plank went sick, you could not simply drive a new bolt beside the old one. The sickness spread, and there was a second problem, quieter than the first. A ship is never still. She works. Every wave twists the hull a little, every swell flexes the planks, and a wooden hull spends its whole life gently breathing against the sea. Iron does not breathe. Iron is stiff and proud, and stays exactly the shape it was forged, so while the oak around it swells and shrinks with every change in weather, the iron sits there refusing to move, and the constant working grinds the whole a hair wider, season after season, until the fastener that was once tight now rattles. A loose fastener lets in water. Water brings rot. Rot brings the end of the ship. So the shipwright had a fastener that corroded the wood, stained the wood, and slowly worked itself loose. You can see why they went looking for something better. What they found had been sitting in the forest the whole time. The fastener they trusted was a tree nail. Say it out loud the way the old yard said it, and the 2 words collapse into one. Tree nail, trunnel. That is all it is. A wooden nail. A peg turned round from the hardest, straightest wood a man could find, usually white oak or black locust. And locust is the one I reach for now, because it is nearly as tough as iron, and it laughs at rot. The shipwright would drive that dry peg through a hole, bored clean through the outer plank, and into the oak frame behind it. And where an iron bolt fought the wood, the trunnel joined it. Same material, same grain, same way of drinking water and letting it go. When the hull swelled, the trunnel swelled with it. When the hull breathed, the trunnel breathed too. It was not a foreign body jammed into the wood. It became part of the wood. And now the part I want you to hold on to, because it is the secret the whole technique turns on. That peg goes in dry, bone dry, drier than the wood around it, and a dry piece of oak is a thirsty thing. Before you can drive a trunnel, though, you have to make one. And this is where most folks go wrong before they have even started, because they walk to the shelf and grab a store-bought dowel. Put it down. A dowel is sawn from a board with no thought to the grain, which means the wood fibers run out the side of it at an angle, and a peg like that will snap the first time the joint puts a real load on it. I learned that the hard way when a peg sheared off below the surface on a boat repair, and I had to drill the whole thing out and start again with the tide coming in. The old shipwrights did not saw their pegs. They rived them. Riving just means splitting the wood along its natural grain instead of cutting across it. You take a straight billet of oak or locust, you set a froe or a stout chisel on the end, and you let the wood tell you where it wants to break. It splits along the grain like a seam opening, and every fiber runs unbroken from one end of that piece to the other. That is what you want. A riven peg has the grain running true down its whole length, so when you drive it and load it, there is no weak angle for it to fail along. It is the difference between a rope pulled straight and a rope frayed halfway through. Split your stock. Never saw it. Trust the wood to show you the line. Once you have your riven billets, you shape them close to round with a knife or a plane, a little fat, a little rough, and you leave them to sit somewhere warm and dry for a good while so they give up their moisture. A dry peg is the whole game. Hold that thought. Before we shape that peg further, one thing. Everything I know about trunnels and the old preservation tricks with pitch and tallow and linseed oil went into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. 150 pages, 16 chapters, 3 full build projects meant to outlast you. If joints that tighten with age are what you're after, the link in the description will take you to it. Now, back to that peg. You have a dry, riven billet, roughly round and a little oversized, and you need to make it truly round and true to size. The old way is a dowel plate, which is nothing more than a thick steel plate with holes of graded sizes bored through it, each hole with a slightly sharp edge. You stand the plate over a hole in the bench, you set your fat peg on top of the correct hole, and you drive it through with a mallet. The steel edge shaves the peg round as it passes, and what drops out the bottom is a clean cylinder the exact size you want. If you have a lathe, you can turn them, and they will be pretty, but I will tell you a secret the pretty ones do not know. A trunnel does not want to be perfectly smooth. A few flats and facets left from the driving actually help it grip. So drive it slightly fat, a hair over the size of your hole, because that tiny bit of extra is going to matter in a moment. Leave a gentle taper on the leading end so it starts easily. That is your peg. Simple as anything, and stronger than any bolt you can buy. Now here is where the shipwright did something that looks like a mistake, and is actually the whole trick. You would think you bore one straight hole through both boards and drive the peg through, and for a plain joint you can. But when the old-timers wanted a joint that pulled itself tight and stayed tight, they used what is called a draw-bore offset. Stay with me, because this is simpler than it sounds. You bore your hole through the first piece, the plank. Then you bring the second piece, the frame, into position and mark where the hole lands on it. And then, on purpose, you bore the hole in the frame a small distance closer to the joint, not much, something near a 1/16 of an inch. The two holes no longer line up perfectly. Now you take your peg, taper the front of it well, and drive it through. The peg meets that offset, and because it is stronger than the wood, it does not follow the crooked path. It forces the two holes into line, and as it does, it drags the frame hard against the plank and pins them together under permanent tension. That is your clamp. Not a bar clamp you take off in an hour, a clamp built into the joint that never lets go. The great builders of the Essex yards would set a draw bore, so the joint drew up with a groan you could hear across the shop, and the old shipwright, who taught the man who taught me, used to say a well-drawn joint would hold longer than you and me both. He was right. Some of those joints are still holding. And now we come back to the thing I told you to hold on to. The peg goes in dry. There is a proper name for what happens next, and it is worth knowing. Hygroscopic differential. Hygroscopic just means a material that takes on and gives off water from the air, which all wood does, and the differential is simply the difference in moisture between two pieces of it. Your peg is bone dry. The timber of an outdoor project, or the oak of a hull, carries more moisture, and the sea carries a great deal more. So the moment that dry peg is driven home, it begins to drink. It pulls moisture out of the wood around it and out of the damp air, and a thirsty piece of oak does one thing when it drinks. It swells. It cannot swell outward into the wood, because the wood is already there, so it swells against it, tighter and tighter, filling every fiber of that hole, until the peg and the plank and the frame are locked together as one solid piece. The wetter it gets, the tighter it holds. Think about that for a second. The very thing that destroys an iron fastener, water, is the thing that sets a wooden one for good. A trunnel driven into a ship gets stronger the day she is launched. It does not loosen at sea. It seizes. There is one last touch, and it is the mark of a real shipwright. Before that peg swells shut, you seal its ends so nothing can ever creep in around them. You do it with a wedge, and the cleverest version is called a fox wedge. It works like this. You cut a shallow saw kerf, a little slot, down into the end of the peg before you drive it. You set a small hardwood wedge loosely into that slot. Then you drive the peg home, and when the bottom of the peg hits the solid wood at the far end, that wedge is forced up into the kerf and spreads the end of the peg wide, flaring it out like the root of a tooth inside the hole. The peg can never back out. It is mechanically flared inside the wood where no one will ever see it. On the outer ends, the ends you can see, the shipwright would drive a second small wedge across the grain and trim it flush, sealing the mouth of the hole tight against water. A single wooden warship might carry many thousands of these, everyone riven, driven, drawn, and wedged by hand. No metal in any of them. And when the ironwork on her rivals had long since bled itself to ruin, her wooden pegs were still holding her together, quiet and dry and swollen tight, exactly as they were the day she first touched the water. So let me put the whole thing back together for you, because every step serves one idea. You rive the stock so the grain runs true and the peg is strong. You drive it dry so it swells and locks. You offset the bore so the joint pulls itself tight. You wedge the ends so nothing works loose and no water finds its way in. Do those 4 things, and you have not fastened 2 boards together. You have persuaded them to become one board that happens to have a seam. It flexes when the wood flexes. It breathes when the wood breathes. It will never rust, because there is nothing in it to rust, and it will never stain the wood around it, because it is the same wood. And this is the part that ought to make every one of us stop and think. It costs almost nothing. There is no box of stainless to buy, no bronze at the price bronze runs these days, no rust to chase down every spring, no soft gray rot to dig out, and no fasteners to back out and replace in 5 years because they have sickened the wood. You make the pegs from a scrap of the same tough oak or locust you are already building with. The cheapest fastener in the whole shop is also the one that outlasts every other. The old builders were not being quaint, they were being smart. I went back to that garden bench in the end. I drilled out every dead, stained screw hole, cut them oversized and clean, glued in fresh locust plugs, and rebuilt the seat the way Ingrid's great-grandfather would have known how. That was 9 years ago. I sat on it this morning with my coffee, and it did not give, not a whisper of travel, and it will not give for a great deal longer than I have left to sit on it. The screws promised me they would never rust. They kept that promise while the wood died around them. The pegs made no promises at all. They just held. If you want the full craft, the watertight seams without glue, the centuries-old ways of pitch and tar and linseed, and 3 complete projects built to outlive their maker, scan the QR code on screen for secrets of the Shipyard. And if wood that lasts is your thing, subscribe to the Master Shipwright, where we keep the ocean tested, centuries-lasting ways alive, one joint at a time.